The shuttle touched down in mud. Not the ceremonial landing pad that had been promised in the briefing documents. The flat permacrete circle surrounded by diplomatic banners and UN-equivalent signage, and the whole theater of first contact formality, but actual mud, thick and red-brown and smelling of iron, because someone on the Vethkai side had moved the perimeter markers 3 kilometers north during the night, either as a test or as a message, probably both. Commander Nara Voss stepped out of the hatch before her escort could form up around her, and the mud took her boot to the ankle. She stood there a moment, let it happen, pulled her foot free with a sound like a slow exhale and kept walking. "Commander!" Specialist Dren fell into step at her right shoulder, his voice low and careful the way it always got when he thought she was about to do something that would end his career. "The landing zone displacement is a protocol violation under the Harrow Accords. We are well within our rights to document it," Nara said. "Don't raise it." "They moved our." "I know what they did." She didn't look at him. Ahead of them, maybe 400 meters across the mudflat, the Vethkai camp rose out of the morning haze like something that had been dreamed by a creature with a different understanding of geometry. 10 structures of dark membrane stretched over arching ribs of pale bone, and between them moved figures that were large and very deliberate in the way they moved, nothing wasted, nothing decorative. She had studied them for 3 years. She still could not read them. "They know we know," she said. "That's the point." She had been told 6 years ago that she was the wrong person for this assignment. The panel at Reach Command had used words like unsuitable and psychologically compromised, and once, in a phrasing she had never forgotten, too personally invested. She had sat in the gray chair in the gray room and listened to them explain that her experience at Callaway Station, while undeniably formative, had left markers in her psych profile that gave the panel pause. And the panel regretted to inform her that the role of primary negotiator for the Vethkai Contact Initiative would be given to someone with a cleaner record. She had been shot 3 times at Callaway Station. She had watched 41 people die in 11 hours. She had been clinically dead for 2 minutes and 14 seconds on a medical slab before a trauma tech named Osai had brought her back with a combination of chemical shock, and Os had told her later with a completely straight face, personal stubbornness. What the panel had called psychologically compromised, Nara had come to understand as something else. She had been to the place where the lights go out and found there was something on the other side of it. Not peace, exactly, more like clarity. The things that mattered had become very obvious. The things that didn't had become transparent. She had appealed. She had been denied. She had appealed again, gone over the panel's heads, found the 3 people in the Reach hierarchy who understood what was actually at stake in the Vethkai Contact Initiative, and made her case to each of them over the course of 14 months. She was here. The camp drew closer. She could hear it now, a low resonance that she knew was communication, Vethkai voices below the range of human comfort, more felt than heard. Like standing near machinery that might or might not be about to stop, like the moment before a verdict. Her escort of 4 had quietly expanded to 8 because the security detail had seen the camp. She didn't stop them. Fear was a reasonable response to the Vethkai in number. She just didn't let it make the decisions. "Commander," said Specialist Dren again. "They're not going to kill us before the talks," Nara said. "They'd have done it from the ridge if they wanted to." "That's remarkably comforting, thank you." It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be accurate. There was a difference, and he knew it, and after 4 years working alongside her, he'd stopped arguing the point. She had a knife in her left boot, which was against protocol, and a sealed letter in her jacket pocket, which was not. The letter had no strategic value. She had written it 6 weeks ago at 300 hours on a night she couldn't sleep, had carried it since, and had told herself she would decide what to do with it when she understood what it was for. She still didn't understand. She carried it anyway. In 14 months of appeals, she had built a case that was architectural in its thoroughness. She had read every intercepted communication, every field report, every second-hand account, every intelligence summary that touched on the Vethkai. She had learned their language to functional proficiency, which none of the previous negotiators had bothered with, because the previous negotiators had believed in the efficacy of translation units and in the professional neutrality of not getting too close. She had learned their ceremonial structures. She had memorized their chain of command. She had spent 3 consecutive weeks reading nothing but Vethkai military history, starting from the earliest records that Reach Intelligence had assembled, because she had decided that you could not understand a people's present without understanding the weight of what they were carrying from their past. She had then spent 1 additional week reading nothing else, letting it settle, and on the 7th day of that week she had written the letter. She had not read it back. She knew what was in it. The entry to the Vethkai encampment was marked by 2 sentries who were approximately the size of draft horses, and equipped with weapons that Reach Intelligence had formally classified as Category Severe. They looked at the approaching human delegation with an expression that Nara had learned, over 3 years of briefings, to read not as aggression, but as something closer to contempt. The specific contempt of those who have decided in advance that what they are looking at is not worth the energy of a full assessment. She stopped in front of them, looked up, let the silence sit. One of the sentries spoke. The translation unit at her collar rendered it, "Small ones, you are expected, War Speaker waits." "We're grateful for the welcome," Nara said. The translation unit rendered this. Both sentries made a sound she'd come to recognize as the Vethkai equivalent of a dry laugh, not warm, but not entirely hostile either. It was a sound that acknowledged the human had said something that was technically a pleasantry, but functionally also a small piece of defiance, because expressing gratitude for a dismissive greeting was a way of refusing to accept the dismissal without making it a confrontation. The Vethkai, she had learned, respected the refusal of dismissal when it was done without aggression. It was something their tradition had a specific word for. The translation units rendered that word as persistence, though she suspected the original meant something more like the quality of a river that carves through stone not through force, but through the refusal to stop. She had been told that she had that quality. Usually it was not said admiringly. They were led through the camp in a route that she was certain had been chosen specifically to maximize the impression of Vethkai numbers and equipment. She counted, from habit. She noted positions and configurations. She also noticed, because she could not help noticing, the smaller details. A child's sleeping mat visible through a tent opening, rolled and tied with what looked like braided grass. A warrior with dried mud on her knee plates who was clearly not done cleaning up from whatever had happened last night. 2 older Vethkai seated close together, not speaking, watching the humans pass with an expression Nara had no entry for in the reference documents. Something that looked like grief. Or maybe just waiting. She had learned not to assume. The reference documents were thorough, and they were also, she had come to believe, fundamentally limited by their method. They had been written by analysts who had never been in a Vethkai encampment, working from intercepted data and the testimony of a handful of defectors who were describing a world that had already become their past. The documents were accurate in the way that a photograph of a person is accurate, capturing the surface, giving you a fixed image that had once been real, unable to convey the temperature of the room or the sound of the voice, or the specific quality of the silence when someone is sitting with something they haven't decided yet. She had known before she arrived that the documents were not going to be enough. She had come anyway. War Speaker Gurak was not what the intelligence reports had prepared her for. The reports had described a decorated field general, age equivalent to mid-human 40s, responsible for 3 successful campaigns in the outer corridor and 1 catastrophic defeat at Hesh Crossing that was believed to have changed her significantly. The reports had described her as volatile, brilliant, resistant to hierarchical control, and profoundly dangerous. They had also, in a section that Nara had read multiple times, noted that Gurak had refused to take another field command after Hesh Crossing, had instead moved into a political military role, and had specifically requested the lead position on the Vethkai side of the contact initiative. Had, in fact, apparently argued for it over a period of several months against internal opposition. Something about that detail had stayed with her. A person who had seen the worst of a war and then asked to be the one who tried to end it. She understood that person, or thought she did, in the way you understand someone you haven't met but have read about until the reading starts to feel like memory. What she saw when she was brought into the command tent was a figure seated on a low platform, not standing, a deliberate choice, she noted, because the seated Gurak was still approximately the same height as a standing human, who was looking at the delegation with a flat attention that reminded Nara of nothing so much as the trauma surgeon who had worked on her at Callaway Station. Not cruel, purely evaluative, deciding what the damage was and whether it was worth addressing. The left arm rested on her knee with the elbow turned slightly out. Nara had been briefed on the knife. Gurak's left sleeve fell to the wrist in the style of Vethkai formal dress, which meant it was exactly the kind of sleeve in which a Vethkai warrior would conceal a blade of the short fighting variety, and Reach Intelligence had spent considerable bandwidth on whether this was tradition or intent, and had arrived, as Reach Intelligence often did, at a carefully worded assessment of probably both. Nara had thought about that sleeve for a long time. She had thought about what it meant to arrive at peace talks carrying a weapon in your sleeve. She had thought about what it might say about the state of a person who felt they needed it. She had thought about her own knife in her left boot, and about the letter in her pocket, and about the ways that carrying things is sometimes how you move forward when putting them down is not yet possible. She stopped in front of the platform. Her escort stopped behind her. The translation units hummed. Gurak said, "You are the one they sent." "I am," Nara said. "They sent a small one, scarred." The yellow eyes moved across her with that surgical attention. "You were broken and repaired." Nara had 3 old scars on the left side of her face from Callaway Station. She had stopped trying to minimize them 5 years ago. She had also stopped explaining them unless someone asked directly, and Gurak had not asked. She had simply named them, the way you name what you observe, without judgment or curiosity, just acknowledgement. "Yes," she said, "at Callaway Station 6 years ago, I was shot. I was also dead for a little over 2 minutes if the medical report is accurate." A beat, the translation units processed. "Dead," Gurak said. "Clinically, then not." Something shifted in the flat yellow gaze. Nara couldn't have said what. It was not warmth, and it was not its opposite. It was something that had no entry in the reference documents, some recognition of a category that she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. "You came back," Gurak said, and the translation unit rendered it almost simultaneously, which meant it was a short construction in the original Vethkai, and something in the cadence of the original language carried a weight that the human translation couldn't fully hold. 2 words, maybe 3, with the compression that her language courses had taught her, was reserved for statements about things that matter more than most things. "I came back," Nara agreed. There was a long silence. Around them, the command tent was full of Vethkai aides and warriors who were either doing their jobs or doing their jobs in order to watch this exchange. And Nara didn't look at any of them, because the thing that was happening in this silence felt fragile in a way she didn't want to disturb. Like the moment between a diagnosis and a decision, like 2 minutes and 14 seconds on a medical slab. Then Gurak said, in a tone that closed the subject, "We will begin." The talks lasted 4 days. They were, by every formal measure, a failure. The Vethkai terms for cessation of hostilities in the outer corridor required human withdrawal from 6 settled systems, 3 of which contained permanent civilian populations, and 2 of which were the primary supply routes for the deep colonization effort that had been running for 30 years. Reach Command's position on those 6 systems had been communicated to Nara in terms that did not leave room for interpretation. There was no version of the conversation in which those terms were acceptable. Nara knew this. Gurak, she suspected, knew this too. She had studied the battle record. She had read Hesh crossing from both sides, the human after-action reports, and the Vethkai accounts that Reach intelligence had assembled through a combination of intercepted communications and the careful testimony of a Vethkai defector who had later asked to return home and been allowed to go. She had read about the 3rd Vethkai defensive under Gurak's command, 300 fighters who had held a narrow pass for 11 days against a human assault that, by the numbers, should have taken it in 40 hours, and she had read about the end of it, which was not in the human after-action reports, but which the defector had described in a single flat sentence. The last 12 were children, and Gurak carried 2 of them out herself. She had read that sentence many times. She carried it the way she carried the letter in her pocket, without fully understanding yet what she was supposed to do with it. On the first day she laid out Reach Command's position clearly and completely, with no softening and no negotiating gambits. Gurak's aides registered visible surprise at this, which she took as confirmation that they had been expecting something more like a performance. Gurak herself registered nothing visible, but she was listening in a way that Nara had learned to recognize, a quality of attention that was not passive, that was active reception, that meant something was being filed and cross-referenced against other things that were already stored. On the second day, Gurak laid out the Vethkai terms with equal directness. Nara listened without interruption. She had the impulse, 3 times, to ask a clarifying question, and 3 times she suppressed it, because she understood by now that in the Vethkai framework a question during formal statement was a challenge rather than a request for information, and she wanted this round of hearing to be clean before the work of response began. When Gurak finished, Nara said, "Those terms aren't acceptable. You know they aren't acceptable." "I know," Gurak said. "Then why are we here?" A pause. The translation units hummed. "You tell me," said Gurak. "You appealed for 3 years to be given this assignment. I have read your record. Why did you want it so badly?" It was not a question that appeared anywhere in the diplomatic playbook. Nara thought about the gray room and the panel and the phrase psychologically compromised. She thought about 2 minutes and 14 seconds on a medical slab. She thought about 41 people in 11 hours and a trauma tech named Osai who had brought her back through stubbornness. "Because I've seen what the alternative looks like," she said, "and I thought I could find a 3rd option." "And have you?" "Not yet," Nara said, "but I haven't stopped looking." On the 3rd day they worked through technical frameworks, the language of agreed definitions and jurisdictional boundaries, and the procedural architecture of an eventual agreement that neither of them had reached. This was the work that looked like diplomacy from the outside and felt, from the inside, more like archaeology, digging through layers of accumulated grievance and prior failure to find the place where something structural had first gone wrong, because you could not build a stable structure on a broken foundation, and both of them knew it. Gurak worked like someone who had learned patience the hard way. She would take a position, hold it under questioning, and then revise it with a precision that suggested she had been thinking about the revision before Nara had asked the question, had known the edge of the position before she stated it, had left herself room to move in one direction only. It was a different kind of strategic thinking than the one Nara had trained in, but she recognized what it was. The thinking of someone who had lost things and learned from the loss what was actually worth holding. They made no progress on the 6 systems. They made quietly some progress on something else, a mutual acknowledgement, never formally stated, that both sides had internal factions who did not want these talks to succeed, and that both negotiators were operating in the knowledge of this. It changed the texture of the room. Not warmth, exactly. Something more like the specific kind of trust that develops between people who are facing the same difficulty from opposite sides of it. On the third night, someone tried to kill her. It was not Gurek. She was reasonably certain of this, both because the method was wrong, a human weapon, a directed energy type that AI forces didn't generally use, and because when she reviewed the camp's perimeter in the aftermath, the most logical position for a Vethkai-executed attack was completely unoccupied, which suggested that whoever had staged this had been given room to maneuver. The Vethkai sentries had either been pulled back deliberately or persuaded to look elsewhere. Neither possibility was reassuring in terms of its implications for internal Vethkai politics, but it was informative. The shot had been close. It had taken out the tent wall 6 inches from her left ear, while she was reviewing the day's notes, and Specialist Dren was asleep 3 meters away. She had been sitting very still, bent forward over the documents, and the shooter had apparently not accounted for this. In the dark, a still figure can look like an empty chair. She had sat with the destroyed tent wall for a long time, listening to the camp sounds, feeling the night air come through the new opening in the membrane, before she woke Dren and told him to document it without raising it. "With respect, Commander," Dren said, looking at the hole in the tent wall, then at her, then at the hole again. "Someone just tried to shoot you." "I know. In a peace negotiation." "I'm aware." The someone was almost certainly. "Document it," she said again. "Don't raise it." "Not yet." Dren looked at her with the expression he wore when he was deciding between professional obedience and personal concern and settling, as he usually did, on a combination of both. "Are you all right?" She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate had returned to baseline within roughly 4 minutes of the shot, which was faster than it used to be, and which she attributed, perhaps unfairly, to the fact that she had already been clinically dead once, and had found that it changed your relationship to the near miss. "Yes," she said, "go back to sleep." He didn't sleep, she didn't either. They sat on opposite sides of the tent in the dark, not talking, while the camp moved and breathed around them and the night continued, and she thought about the knife in the sleeve and who, besides Gurek, might have an opinion about how these talks ended. On the 4th day, Gurek said, "There are those who do not want these talks to succeed." "I know," Nara said. "They tried to demonstrate that last night." The yellow eyes were very still. "You are still here." "Yes." "A different person would have left." "A different person might have." Nara looked at her hands on the table. They were steady. They had been steady since Callaway Station. She had bought that steadiness at a price she still occasionally felt the installments of, but she had it. "I don't leave things I've started." "It's a character flaw, probably." "Or a survival mechanism," Gurek said, and for the first time in 4 days her voice held something that wasn't evaluation, something looser, possibly something like recognition. The talk still ended without agreement. There was a formal closing session with the correct ceremonial elements performed in the correct order, the exchange of sealed summaries, the mutual acknowledgement of the other side's stated positions, the formal recording of the points of irreconcilable difference that the framework required, and that felt to Nara like writing down the shape of a door that hadn't opened yet. She said the required words. Gurek said the required words. Their aides filed the required documents. Then there was the walk back across the mudflat to the shuttle. It was a better morning than the arrival had been. 4 days of sun had dried the mud to something merely difficult rather than treacherous, and the air had lost the iron sharpness it had carried at dawn 4 days ago and taken on something warmer, something that might have been almost pleasant if you were not also carrying the residual weight of a failed negotiation and a bullet hole in a tent wall. She was 20 meters from the shuttle when she heard steps behind her, very large steps, moving quickly. She stopped, turned. Gurek stood alone in the space between the camp and the shuttle, without aides, without escort. It was the first time Nara had seen her without aid since the talks began. The morning light hit the dark armor plates across her shoulders and made them look almost iridescent. She hadn't noticed that before, that quality in the material, that the plates were not simply dark, but dark in the way that certain things are dark when there's something underneath the surface. The left arm hung at her side with the sleeve fallen forward over the wrist. Nara looked at the sleeve. Gurak looked at her looking at it. "I know about the knife," Nara said. "I know you know. Did you bring it today to use or to decide?" A long silence. The wind came across the mudflat and moved the hem of Gurak's formal outer coat and did nothing else. "To decide," Gurak said. Nara nodded. "What did you decide?" Gurak looked at her for a moment that stretched in a way that moments sometimes do when they are also something else, when they contain more than their duration. Then she reached into the sleeve with her right hand and removed the knife, short, curved, made of something that was not quite metal, worked with markings along the flat of the blade that Nara couldn't read, and held it in her open palm. "Not a threat, a display." "At Hesh Crossing," Gurak said, "I carried 2 children out of a pass that your forces had bombed for 6 days. One of them did not survive the carrying. I did not know this until I reached the rear line and looked at what I was holding." Nara didn't speak. "I have had this knife for 12 years. I take it into every engagement. I took it into these talks because every negotiation is an engagement. I have used it many times. And today..." Gurak looked at the blade in her hand. The markings caught the light. "Today I am considering whether I am tired of carrying it." This was the moment. Nara could feel it the way she could sometimes feel a structural shift in a conversation before the words that caused it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather, the way you feel the weight of a question before it's asked. She had prepared for many versions of this meeting. She had prepared for aggression and for bad faith, and for the performance of good faith with nothing behind it. She had prepared for hostility and for calculated warmth, and for the diplomatic theater that both sides had been conducting, with varying degrees of commitment, for the last 4 days. She had not exactly prepared for this, but she had spent 6 years becoming someone who could be present in moments she hadn't prepared for. That was perhaps the only thing the panel had been right about. The experience had changed her, not in the direction they had meant, but it had changed her in the direction of this, whatever this was, this moment in the mud with a knife in an open palm and the first honest thing either of them had said outside of the formal sessions. She reached into her jacket pocket. The letter, she had been carrying it for 6 weeks. She had written it at 300 hours on a sleepless night with the Vethkai intelligence files spread around her on the floor of her quarters, and she had not known why she was writing it or who it was for, only that something in what she was reading demanded a response from a part of her that didn't communicate in briefing documents. She had written it the way you write something that needs to exist before you understand it. She had sealed it and carried it. She held it out. Gurak looked at it. "What is that?" "A letter." "To whom?" "I didn't know when I wrote it. I think I know now." Gurak took the letter. She held it with a particular carefulness, not the care of someone handling something fragile, but the care of someone handling something whose value they hadn't yet assessed, which was a different and more considered kind of handling. She didn't open it. Nara had known she wouldn't, not here, not in front of the camp and the shuttle and the spaces between both. "It's about Hesh Crossing," Nara said. "It's about what I read in the defector accounts, about the 12, she paused, "about what you were carrying when you came out." The silence that followed was different from the diplomatic silences of the previous 4 days. Those had been tactical. This one was something else. The kind of silence that is not an absence but a presence, that happens in the space between one true thing and the next. "How does a soldier from the other side," Gurak said slowly, "know what I was carrying?" "Because I've read everything I could find about you for 3 years. because I wanted to understand who you were before I sat across a table from you. Nara kept her voice level. And because I think understanding who someone is matters more than knowing what they want. Another silence, longer. The knife turned in Gurek's palm. Once, twice. The markings caught the light and released it like something breathing. Then Gurek said, "The child who survived, she is 17 now. She wants to be a teacher." Something moved in Nara's chest that wasn't tactical and wasn't professional, and she didn't try to name it. "That's good," she said. "That's really good. She does not know what she cost me to bring her out. I have not told her." The yellow eyes found Nara's face. "Some things you carry and you do not put them down and you do not explain them. You simply carry." "I know," Nara said. "You have your own." "Yes." 41, Gurek said, and Nara went very still, because that number was in no report that the Vethkai should have had access to. It was in her medical record and her psychological evaluation, and in exactly one letter she had written to a trauma tech named Osai who had almost certainly kept it private. 41. "You're dead at Callaway Station." "How do you know that number?" "Because I also read everything I could find," Gurek said, "for 3 years. The shuttle was 20 meters away. The camp was 400 meters in the other direction. Between them was a mudflat that smelled of iron and a morning that was becoming, against all probability, something worth standing still in." "The talks failed," Nara said. "This time. We didn't find the third option." "Not yet," Gurek said, and the echo was deliberate and Nara heard it land. "But you have not stopped looking." Nara looked at the knife in the open palm. "Are you going to put that away?" Gurek looked at it too. A long assessment, internal, the kind that had nothing to do with an audience and everything to do with what a person knows about themselves on a given morning after a given 4 days. Then she folded her fingers around it carefully and slid it back into the sleeve. Not using it, not discarding it, carrying it differently. "I'll be back," Nara said. "With better terms, different framing, I need 3 months." "You will need more than 3 months." "Probably, but 3 is what I'm asking for." The yellow eyes were still and level, and doing something she had no entry for in the reference documents. Something that might have been, in a different face, in a different species, in a different set of centuries of mutual damage. Something that might have been the beginning of a decision. 3 months, Gurek said. 3 months. A beat, then go home, Commander Voss, you smell like our mud. Nara almost laughed. It came up through her chest like something physical, a reflex, and she let it out, brief and genuine, and she saw Gurek's jaw shift fractionally in a way that the reference documents would have called non-hostile response to humor, and that Nara would have called something a little warmer than that. Something that didn't have a category yet. She turned and walked the 20 meters to the shuttle. Dren was waiting in the hatch. He looked at her and then looked past her at the single large figure standing in the mudflat, and then looked at her again with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was recalibrating his understanding of events. "Did she just," he started. "Get us in the air," Nara said. "I'll write the report on the way." "The talks failed." "The talks gave us 3 months." She climbed the hatch steps. Her boots left red-brown mud on the interior floor. She sat down and took out her pad and held it without writing anything for a moment, looking at the viewport as the shuttle lifted and the camp below reduced to geometry and color, and the mudflat caught the morning sun and flashed briefly, red-gold, like something alive. 3 months. She thought about the letter, now in Gurek's possession. She thought about a 17-year-old who wanted to be a teacher. She thought about a knife going back into a sleeve with the decision still unmade, or maybe made differently, maybe made in the only direction that mattered, carried, not used, waiting for a day when it might not need to be carried at all. She began to write. The report took 90 minutes and covered the formal elements of the talks in the careful language that Reach Command required and that she had learned over many years to write without letting it flatten what had actually happened. She was good at this. She had been good at many versions of this, the translation of lived experience into institutional language, the conversion of the specific and felt into the general and durable, the craft of it. She didn't resent the craft. She just made sure that it served the event rather than replacing it. At the end, she wrote a section labeled Recommendation that was longer than such sections usually were, and said things that the panel in the gray room 6 years ago would have called psychologically compromised, including a paragraph about a child who had survived a pass at Hesh Crossing and now wanted to be a teacher, and what that meant, and why it mattered, and why the math of this conflict was not the math of systems and supply routes, but of what people carried in their sleeves, and whether they were given a reason to consider putting it down. She sent it. Then she leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes and thought about nothing useful for about 3 minutes, which was approximately what she allowed herself. Then Dren said, very carefully, what was in the letter. Private correspondence. Addressed to the war speaker of a hostile force. Addressed to a person, Nara said, who I needed to understand before I could talk to. A pause. Is that in the protocol documents? It will be, she said, after this. Outside, the continent fell away below them. The planet was green-brown and enormous in the way that all inhabited planets were enormous when you saw them from the right altitude, full of all their particular weight, all the specific lives being lived on them in their specific ways, the grief and the 17-year-olds and the knives in sleeves, and the things carried without explanation across years. Nara had learned to look at it that way. The altitude helped. You could see the shape of things better from up here. The distance didn't make it smaller, it made it visible. She thought about Gurak standing in the mudflat with the morning light on her shoulder plates and the letter in her hand, and the knife sliding back into the sleeve. She thought about what it means to come back from somewhere dark, how you're changed by it, but not only in the ways that panels and assessments can measure, how some of the changes are clarifications rather than damages, how you learn to see, very precisely, the things that matter, how the things that don't matter become transparent, and how that transparency is sometimes its own kind of gift, because it leaves you more room for the things that do. She thought 3 months. And then she thought it's enough. It doesn't have to be everything. It just has to be enough to keep going. The shuttle climbed. In the Vethkai camp below, a war speaker sat in her command tent with a sealed letter in her hand and did not open it for a long time. Around her, the camp moved in its deliberate rhythms, and through the tent opening the morning light fell in at an angle that illuminated the dust in the air and made it look, briefly, like something meaningful. Her aides moved around her in the careful way that people who have known someone a long time move around them when something has shifted. Not asking, not commenting, just adjusting their orbit slightly, giving the changed thing room. She turned the letter over once, twice. Then she set it down carefully on the platform beside her, the way you set down something you intend to come back to. Outside, a child's sleeping mat lay rolled and tied with braided grass. 2 old warriors sat close together in the silence that was not quite grief, and not quite anything else, watching the sky where the human shuttle was becoming a point of light, and then less than that. The war speaker looked at her left sleeve. She did not reach into it. The morning continued. 2 months and 26 days later, a message arrived at Reach Command on an encrypted channel that had not existed before that morning. It carried a single line of text in the AI primary script, followed by a single line of text in Standard, which was unusual because the Vethkai did not communicate in Standard as a rule, and the fact that this one did meant that the sender had composed it as a gesture rather than a communication, had translated their own words into a language they considered lesser in order to make certain there was no ambiguity, no distance. No possibility of rendering error between the meaning and the recipient. The Vethkai line read in translation, the one you sent, send her again. The standard line, unrendered as originally written, I have read the letter. Nara Voss was in the canteen when her comm chimed. She read the message twice. She set the comm down. She picked up her coffee, which was cold because it had been cold for 20 minutes while she was absorbed in the system's analysis. She'd been running on the supply route question, looking for a configuration that Reach Command could accept, and that didn't strip the Vethkai settlement buffer that Gurak had named as a line she would not move on. She had been looking for that configuration for 85 days. She thought she had found it 4 days ago. She thought, reading the message a third time, that she might actually get to use it. Dren across the table watched her face. Good news or bad news? She thought about a knife in a sleeve and a sealed letter and a mudflat that smelled of iron in the early morning and a 17-year-old who wanted to teach things to other people, which was perhaps the most human impulse in the universe. And also, she was beginning to believe, not exclusively human, the impulse to take what you know and give it forward, to make yourself a bridge between what you survived and what comes after. To say, I was here and I learned this, and I want it to be useful to someone who comes after me. Good news, she said. She finished her coffee. She went to find the 3 people in the Reach hierarchy who understood what was actually at stake. She had 4 days before the 3 months were up. She did not waste them. The second round of talks was held on neutral orbital station Meridian 7, which was a compromise that neither side had asked for and both sides had accepted, which Nara took as a sign that both sides were tired of the mud. The station was cold and angular and smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and had a view of the planet below that was, she had to admit, considerably better than the view from the mudflat. Neutral ground has a different weight to it. No one owns it. No one has moved the landing markers. The machinery of mutual inconvenience runs at exactly the same level for both parties, which is not comfortable, but it is a kind of equality. Gurak arrived with a smaller retinue than before. She was wearing a different outer coat, less formal, and the left sleeve had been cut shorter, not to the elbow but shorter than protocol required. Visible, the wrist. Visible, the absence of the trailing fabric that made concealment easy. Nara noticed. She didn't say anything. They sat across the table in the same configuration as before, translation units humming, and Nara laid out the revised terms. She had worked on them for 89 days. She had argued for them in 9 separate sessions with Reach Command, 2 of which had become shouting, 1 of which had ended with her walking out of the room, and all of which had ended with her walking back in and continuing to make the case because she did not leave things she had started, and because she had the specific stubbornness. She had been told by multiple people who meant it as a criticism of a river carving through stone. The terms gave back 3 of the 6 systems. Not the supply routes. She hadn't been able to move Reach Command on the supply routes, and she had decided to stop trying and to present that obstacle honestly rather than diplomatically, because she had come to believe that honesty was a more durable foundation than strategy, and because she thought Gurak would know the difference. She presented the obstacle honestly. Gurak was quiet for a long time, longer than the supply routes warranted, which meant she was thinking about something beyond the supply routes. Then she said, "The supply routes are yours." Nara went still. "But the 3 systems, the ones with the civilians." Gurak's hand moved on the table, a gesture that the reference documents categorized as formal emphasis, and that Nara had come to read as something more personal, a way of making words physical, of putting weight behind them. Those are returned, and there will be no military presence within 16 light towers of the settlement boundaries. "I can get that," Nara said. "Can or will?" "Will." Another silence. Longer. Gurak's eyes were on the table, on some middle distance that wasn't the room, that was maybe somewhere else entirely. A pass, a child, a letter read and reread and kept somewhere, in a coat pocket or a sealed container or simply folded and carried, because that is what you do with things that matter. There is a thing in our tradition, Gurak said slowly. When a dispute is ended, when the carrying is done, she reached into the shorter sleeve and removed the knife. The room went very still. Nara's escort behind her had definitely tensed. She could feel it without looking. Dren's breathing changed. Gurak placed the knife flat on the table, point toward herself, and slid it to the center. Not a threat, not a surrender, a gesture. It is called the setting down, Gurak said. The weapon is placed between the parties. Neither takes it. It remains between them as evidence that both chose to stop carrying it. Nara looked at the knife in the center of the table, the markings along the flat blade. 12 years of being carried through campaigns and defeats, and the specific weight of what you hold when you thought you were holding something alive and found out you were wrong. 12 years, laid down on a table on a cold orbital station while a planet turned below. She reached into her jacket. Not the letter, she had no letter this time, but she had thought about this moment. Not precisely, not with full knowledge of how it would arrive, but in the general way you think about the shape of a thing before it takes its final form. She had known, somewhere in the 89 days of revision and argument and cold coffee and 300 hours work sessions, that she would need something for this. She had known it the way she sometimes knew things now, not prediction exactly. More like the body's understanding of the direction of things before the mind has the words for it. She placed her rank insignia on the table, the cluster of small enamel markers that identified her position, her authority, her function in the hierarchy that had sent her here. The things that said, "This is what I am in the structure that made me." She slid it to the center. It came to rest beside the knife. Gurak looked at it. "You are giving up your rank." "I'm giving up the performance of rank," Nara said. "For this conversation, for whatever comes after this conversation, I want to be in the room as a person, not a function." She paused. "I think that's what the letter was about. That's what I was trying to say at 300 hours when I wrote it. That I read about you as a person before I came to you as a function. And I think that might be the only way this actually works." The yellow eyes were very still. Then Gurak said, "You are a strange creature, Commander Voss." "Probably," Nara said. "I have been told the same about myself." "I know, I read it." Something happened in Gurak's face. Not a smile, it was not structured for that, but something adjacent, something that was a close relative of warmth, a different temperature. The thing you feel when you've been understood in the way you needed to be understood, not in the way that is convenient. "We will draft the framework," she said. "It will take time. There will be disputes. There will be factions on both sides who will attempt to destroy what we build here. It may fall apart. It might. But you will come back." "I will always come back," Nara said. "It's a character flaw. Or a survival mechanism. Both maybe." Gurak looked at the knife and the rank insignia lying together on the table, two things removed from places of concealment and placed in the space between two people who had spent 3 years reading about each other, and then spent 4 days in a mudflat, and then spent 89 more days becoming people who could arrive at this table carrying what was necessary and no more. Both, she agreed. Outside the viewport, the planet turned in the particular slow way that planets do when you're watching them from the right altitude, full of their own enormous weight and all the lives being lived on them. Children wanting to be teachers, warriors carrying what they carry, people coming back from places that changed them and finding that the change, while not always welcome, was also sometimes the exact shape of what was needed. The specific texture of it, the small human and not human gestures that made the universe feel not safe, not resolved, not finished, but inhabited, full of someone trying. The knife stayed on the table between them. The talks continued. 3 years later, the framework for cessation and coexistence in the outer corridor was signed on the same orbital station, in the same room, at the same table. Nara Voss and War Speaker Gurak signed on behalf of their respective governing bodies, which had each had 2 changes of senior leadership during the intervening years, and had each, at various points, attempted to replace their primary negotiator. Neither replacement had held. The framework was not a peace treaty in the fullest sense. It was a structure for coexistence, which was a different and more honest thing. An acknowledgement that the damage between their peoples was real and ongoing and would not be resolved by paperwork, but that the paperwork could provide a shape inside which the resolving might happen if people continued to do the work. It left the knife on the table. Not literally. The knife had gone back into Gurak's keeping after the second round of talks, and as far as Nara knew it was still there, still carried, still being decided about. But figuratively, the framework left the hard questions for the generations that came after, which was honest, and left in place the structures that might allow those generations to answer them differently than their predecessors had. This was, Nara had come to believe, the most you could actually do. You could not resolve centuries in a conference room. You could create conditions. You could leave the door open. You could make sure that the person who came after you inherited a door instead of a wall. At the signing, Gurak stood beside her in front of the assembled observers from both sides. A gathering that was formal and tense, and also, in a way that neither side was quite willing to name, historically improbable, and said something under her breath in Vethkai that the translation units were not calibrated to catch. Nara caught it. Her AI was functional. It had been functional for years. She repeated it back, under her breath in the original. Gurak turned to look at her. The yellow eyes, the expression that the reference document still couldn't fully describe. "You understood that," Gurak said. "I've been listening for a long time," Nara said. The signing continued. Afterwards, in the small room adjacent to the main chamber where the refreshments had been laid out, and the observers were making the careful conversation of people who were not sure yet whether to celebrate, Nara stood at the viewport and looked at the planet below. Dren appeared at her shoulder. He was holding 2 cups of something hot that smelled like coffee, but was almost certainly not. "Not bad," he said, which was, from Dren, the equivalent of a standing ovation. "No," she agreed. "Think it'll hold." She thought about walls and doors, about rivers and stone, about a knife in a shorter sleeve and a rank insignia on a table and a 17-year-old who by now was 20 might already be teaching. About 41 people and 2 minutes and 14 seconds, and a trauma tech stubbornness that had, through a chain of causes she could trace if she tried, led to this room and this viewport and this particular morning. "I think it'll hold long enough," she said, "for someone after us to make it hold longer." That was the answer. It was not a triumphant answer. It was the kind of answer that required a person to be comfortable with incompleteness, with the understanding that the things you build are not for you, not fully, that the best you can do is build them well and leave room in them for the next person's contribution. She was comfortable with it. She had been, she thought, since 2 minutes and 14 seconds on a medical slab, since the lights went out and came back different. Since she'd learned that coming back doesn't mean everything is repaired. It means you're still here. It means you have more to do. She drank the thing that wasn't quite coffee. Across the room, Gurak stood with 2 of her senior aides, speaking in a low register that was meant to be private. Her left hand rested at her side with the sleeve falling, shorter now than the formal dress required, in a way that was clearly a choice. In a way that said, "I have revised what I need to conceal, and what I choose to carry openly, and those are different things now." She looked up and across the room and met Nara's eyes. Something passed between them that neither the translation units nor the reference documents could have rendered. The acknowledgement of shared weight. The specific recognition of two people who had read everything they could find about each other and then sat across a table and found that the person was more than the record, that the record was a door, not a wall, and that walking through it was the work. Nara raised her cup. Gurek inclined her head. The planet turned below them in the slow way that planets do. Outside in the corridor, somewhere out of sight, someone was laughing. Human or Vethkai she couldn't tell, and after a moment she stopped trying. It was just the sound of someone finding something genuinely funny in a room where both sides were present, which was not a resolution, and was not a guarantee, and was also, she thought, not nothing. It was, in fact, exactly the right amount. She turned back to the viewport. The planet was green-brown and full of its own enormous weight, and all the lives being lived on it, including the one being lived by a young woman in a settlement that was no longer under military threat, who had chosen to spend her life making sure that what she knew reached the people who came after her. I was here, that choice said. I learned this. I wanted to be useful. Nara understood it. She had been making that same choice in her own way since the lights came back on. She was still making it. She intended to keep making it for as long as she had.